Welcome everybody again, and a special welcome again to Professor Robert Brandom as this year's holder of the Spinoza Chair at the University of Amsterdam. Professor Brandom, and I'm only going to introduce him very briefly because we've got the longer introduction also by the Dean on the film from last week's lecture. But Professor Brandom is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the University of Pittsburgh, and we're delighted and honored that he is in Amsterdam as the Spinoza Chair of 2021. Last week, Professor Brandom gave a lecture entitled A Rortyian Pragmatist Master Argument. But today, he's going to talk about Hegel's recollective account of representation. After the lecture, we will have a question and answer session, and the discussion will be chaired by my colleague, Dr. Christian Skirky. And you can type your questions into the Q&A tool of the Zoom. I don't think the chat works, so please use the Q&A function. And the handout you can find in the chat, which is, yeah, I had put it in the chat. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Brandom, for being here in which way ever. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. In my first lecture, I talked about the evolution of Rorty's arguments against semantic representationalism. Today, I want to argue that the considerations and commitments that shape the final anti-authoritarian argument of Rorty's that I reconstructed there are among the central concerns that Hegel addresses in his Phenomenology. Hegel takes over from Kant the insight that what distinguishes us sapient, discursive beings from merely natural ones is the normative character of the space in which we live and move and have our being. His focal concept of Geist, what the Phenomenologie des Geistes is a phenomenology of, is the whole comprising all of our implicitly norm-governed performances, practices, and institutions, the explicit theoretical expressions of them that constitute our normative self-consciousness, and everything that those normative practices and institutions make possible. The most obvious consequence of Hegel's treating Geist as of co-equal significance with the individual self-consciousnesses who are made what they are by Geist and who actualize and reflect on it, on which Kant had concentrated, is both to socialize and to historicize the conception of normativity, which remains the axial conception for both figures. For Hegel, normative statuses are essentially social statuses, products of individuals' practical attitudes towards one another, aspects of the roles they play in social practices. Hegel is the original social pragmatist about normativity, as Dewey and Rorty acknowledge. In addition, Hegel understands Geist itself as having a history. For him, the defining transformative event in history, simply the most important thing that ever happened to us, is the rolling, extended, still incomplete transition from traditional to distinctively modern forms of normativity, and so of selves and self-consciousness. To understand his conception of the titanic sea change in the most fundamental metaphysical structure of normativity, we need to look more closely at the vocabulary he deploys to talk about norms. That is, to talk about what makes us, and not just part of it. At the base of Hegel's conception of us is the distinction between what we are in ourselves and what we are for ourselves. We are what things can be something for, and prime among the things that can be something for us is us, ourselves. I understand Hegel's talk about what we are in ourselves as talk about our normative statuses, and his talk about what we are for ourselves as his way of talking about normative attitudes. And each of these is further subdivided. The principal dimensions of what we are in ourselves, for Hegel, he calls independence and dependence. I understand those Hegelian terms, when applied to individual self-conscious selves as normative subjects, to be ways of talking about authority and responsibility, or right and obligation, entitlement and commitment. The principal dimensions of what we are for ourselves is what a self-consciousness is, on the one hand, for others, and on the other hand, what it is for itself. I understand these to correspond to normative statuses we attribute to others and those we acknowledge or undertake ourselves. Put in these terms, what shatters the traditional normative order is the dawning practical and theoretical realization that we are essentially self-conscious beings, in the sense that what we are in ourselves depends on, is responsible to, what we are for ourselves. It's the discovery, as I want to put it, of the attitude dependence of normative statuses. The contrasting traditional practical understanding, which forms the dark background against which the modern insight stands out in bright relief, sees normative statuses of authority in the form of superiority and responsibility in the form of subordination as objective, attitude-independent features of a normative order we find rather than make. The purest theoretical expression of this traditional practical conception of norms is the scala naturae, the great chain of being. Although it has many dimensions, at its core, it's a normative order of superiority and subordination, the authority to command and the obligation to obey. At its summit is God, and below him all the serried ranks of angels, seraphim, cherubim, thrones and domination, all the way down to mere archangels. And below that, through the feudal order of kings and lords, down to peasants, hierarchically organized animals, vegetables, and even minerals, which are apparently fair game to be bossed around by just about anybody. Our cognitive task is to discover what is fitting or proper, how things objectively ought to be. And our practical task is to bring our conduct and subjective attitudes into accord with those attitude-independent, objective normative facts. Those are the ought-to-dos determined by my station and its duties, which articulate the ought-to-bes. The principle organizing this traditional order is accordingly the status dependence of normative attitudes. The normative order is understood as objective, whether natural or supernatural, not the product of subjective attitudes or social practices. It's found and not made. Hegel understands the practical realization that's the driving motor of modernity as finding explicit expression in the Enlightenment's rejection of this traditional picture as fetishism, the projection of the products of the activity of human subjects into an objective form in which they're no longer recognizable as such. Modernity, according to Hegel, is the replacement of the practical construal of norms structured by implicit commitment to the status dependence of normative attitudes by a practical construal of norms structured by explicit commitment to the attitude dependence of normative statuses. It's the most important event in the history of Geist. As I'm characterizing Hegel's thought, his idea is that social pragmatism about norms is the master idea of modernity, and the Enlightenment is the explicit theoretical self-consciousness of this change of practical attitude and this change in the structure of Geist itself. Rorty, Dewey, and Hegel are at one on this point, even though they express it differently. But the historicity of Geist in this sense is only one dimension of Hegel's historicism. Essentially self-conscious creatures, those for whom what they are in themselves depends on what they are for themselves, are subjects of a distinctive kind of transformative, self-creative process. For changing what they are for themselves changes what they are in themselves. As essentially self-conscious, they're consequently essentially historical beings. They don't have natures, they only have histories. For if you want to understand what they are in themselves, you have to rehearse the cascade of changes in what they were for themselves, which occasion changes in what they were in themselves, followed by new changes in what they were for themselves, and so on. The form of this retrospective understanding of historical beings as having histories rather than natures is Hegelian recollection, Erinnerung. Applied to Geist as a whole, it's phenomenology. Hegel's original conception of a distinctive kind of recollective rationality is the key to understanding his account of the representational dimension of conceptual content and how it satisfies the constraints operative in Rorty's final anti-authoritarian argument for global anti-representationalism, his response to the argument I gave last time. So far, I've indicated how commitment to social pragmatism about normativity is built deeply into Hegel's understanding of the advance that modernity makes over traditional ways of living and understanding ourselves. It shows up as the realization of the attitude dependence of normative statuses. In fact, it takes the specific form of the Enlightenment idea that normative statuses are instituted by practical normative attitudes. The Enlightenment sees, as traditional thinkers had not, that there were no superiors and subordinates, no authority and responsibility, until people started practically taking or treating each other as superiors and subordinates, authoritative and responsible. It's playing that role in a social web of practical attitudes that confers normative significance on the performances of participants in social practices of attributing and acknowledging authority and responsibility. This is one of the three commitments I claimed Rorty's skeptical conclusions about representation and represented reality rests on. Looking at some of the fine structure of Hegel's account of the social practices that institute normative statuses will both show how he subscribes also to the interdependence of authority and responsibility that Rorty invokes as a second premise, and illuminate the interplay of normative attitudes and normative statuses that's articulated along the historical dimension of Hegel's story. Kant, too, endorsed a version of the modern insight into the attitude dependence of normative statuses. His normative conception of discursive creatures as autonomous is the idea that we're normatively, genuinely normatively bound only by commitments that we ourselves endorse and acknowledge. This contrasts with merely natural beings, which are bound by laws that are independent of their attitudes. We're bound, he says, rather by our conceptions of rules. Only we can normatively bind ourselves by our attitudes. These are the two sides of autonomy, nomos and autos, the law and the self-binding by it. This is what Kant makes of Rousseau's dictum that, quote, obedience to a law one has prescribed to oneself is freedom. The basic Kantian normative status, the status of being an autonomous subject of normative attitudes and statuses, is having the authority to undertake commitments, the authority to make oneself responsible by taking oneself to be responsible. This is the authority, a normative status, to institute commitments or responsibilities, another kind of status, by adopting an attitude, acknowledging or undertaking that commitment or responsibility. Building on and developing this Kantian idea, Hegel understands normative statuses to be socially synthesized by attitudes of what he calls recognition, Anerkennung, at least in the case when those recognitive attitudes are reciprocated. Recognizing others is taking them to be normative subjects. That is taking them to be the subjects of normative statuses and attitudes, able to be responsible and to exercise authority, and to attribute those statuses to others and acknowledge, undertake, or claim them themselves. The intuition at the root of Hegel's socializing of Kant's normative picture is the idea that genuinely to be responsible depends not only on one's acknowledging a responsibility oneself, but also on others holding one responsible. Kant expresses a weaker version of this idea in his claim that autonomous beings have an obligation to respect the autonomy of others. To respect the dignity of others as free beings in this normative sense is to attribute to them the authority to commit themselves, to make themselves responsible by taking themselves to be responsible. But for Kant, the normative status of autonomy and its dignity is just a fact, albeit a distinctive and distinctively significant kind of fact. And the attitude of respect or recognition by others is merely an appropriate reflection and acknowledgement of that fact, a status-dependent attitude. Hegel's radical idea is that that attitude of respect or recognition by others is as constitutive of the status as the subject's own commitment instituting attitudes are. Not only are commitments and responsibilities attitude-dependent statuses, but so is the authority to institute statuses by one's attitudes. Only the right social constellation of attitudes of attributing and acknowledging authority and responsibility institutes genuine normative statuses for Hegel, actualizing what otherwise remain merely virtual objects of attitudes. Taking normative statuses to be instituted by reciprocal recognitive attitudes involves assigning to the members of a recognitive community authority and responsibility that are coordinate and complementary. It's entirely up to me whom I recognize, in the sense of granting or attributing to them the authority to hold me responsible. But it's not then up to me whether they recognize me in turn, nor what exactly they hold me responsible for, nor whether they take me to have fulfilled that responsibility. The idea is that what I'm actually committed to, this aspect of what I as a normative subject am in myself, my statuses, is the product of my attitudes and the attitudes of others, whom I recognize and who recognize me in turn. It's the product of the responsibilities I acknowledge and of what I'm held responsible for. Consider the status of being a good chess player. Achieving that status is not something I can do simply by coming subjectively to adopt a certain attitude toward myself. It is, in a certain sense, up to me whom I regard as good chess players, whether I count any wood pusher who can play a legal game, only formidable club players, masters, or even grandmasters. That is, it's up to me whom I recognize as good chess players in the sense in which I aspire to be one. But it's not then in the same sense up to me whether I qualify as one of them. To earn their recognition in turn, I must be able to play up to their standards, to earn their recognition. To be, say, a formidable club player, I must be recognized as such by those I recognize as such. My recognitive attitudes can define a virtual community, but only the reciprocal recognition by those I recognize can make me actually a member of it, accord me the status for which I have implicitly petitioned by recognizing them. My attitudes exercise recognitive authority precisely in determining whose recognitive attitudes I make myself responsible to for my actual normative status. And parenthetically, I would say the status of being a good writer or a good philosopher is instituted by this reciprocal recognition in the same sort of way. I can make things hard on myself or easy on myself. I can make it very easy to earn the recognition in this respect of those I recognize as good chess players if I'm prepared to set my standards low enough. If I count as a good chess player anyone who can play a legal game, I won't have to learn much in order to earn the recognition by those who can play a legal game of my capacity to play a legal game. The cost is, of course, that what I achieve is only to be entitled to classify myself as a member of this not at all exclusive community. On the other hand, if I want to be entitled to look up to myself, as it were, I can exercise my independence, my authority, and set my standards high, recognizing only grandmasters as good chess players. To be entitled to class oneself with them, to be aware of oneself as possessing the status they give concrete determinate content to, would be an accomplishment indeed. But it's not easy to earn their recognition as a good chess player in that sense, that is, by those standards. The thought is that the normative status of being, as I say, a good writer or a good philosopher involves the same sort of constellation of authority and responsibility distributed among members of a community instituted by reciprocal recognitive attitudes. This story about normative statuses as instituted by reciprocal recognitive attitudes is a sophisticated, richly structured version of social pragmatism about norms. The central application of the reciprocal recognition model of the institution of normative statuses by attitudes is for specifically discursive commitments. Language, Sprache, Hegel tells us, is the Dasein of Geist, its concrete, immediate actuality. It's entirely up to me which counter in the language game I play, whether I undertake the commitment expressed by "this coin is copper," for instance. But what exactly I've committed myself to thereby, the content of that commitment, isn't up to me. That content is administered by those that I and other users of the term copper acknowledge as authoritative, those we recognize as metallurgical experts. They will hold me responsible for being committed to the coin's melting at 1085 degrees C and to its conducting electricity, even if I have no beliefs or different beliefs about copper's melting point and electrical conductivity. So Hegel also builds deep into his social model of the attitude dependence of normative statuses, his version of social pragmatism about norms, the reciprocity of authority and responsibility that leads Rorty to be skeptical about the very idea of non-human authority. Whether God, with respect to our practical attitudes and commitments, or a represented objective reality with respect to our cognitive attitudes and commitments. Recognitive practical normative attitudes institute the most basic normative statuses, being the subject of normative statuses and attitudes at all. And they do so only when they have the right social structure, when they're mutual or reciprocal, which is to say, when the authority of each member of the recognitive community instituted by those attitudes is balanced by a coordinate responsibility to others whose recognitive authority has been recognized in turn. Reciprocal recognitive attitudes are normative relations among us because they define who we are. We can't stand in such relations to what is other, in the sense defined by its otherness to us. If there are other significant normative relations that are not themselves recognitive relations, they must be understood ultimately in terms of recognitive attitudes. For without reciprocal recognition, there's no normativity, no Hegelian Geist. And this thought is all fully in accord with Rorty's account and the motivations for his skepticism about the notion of representation. Hegel also takes over from Kant a normative understanding of the significance of specifically representational relations. However they're established or instituted, to count as representational relations, whatever plays the role of representeds must exercise a distinctive kind of authority over what can only count as representings of them if they're suitably responsible to those representeds. What's represented must be intelligible as providing a normative standard authoritative for assessments of the correctness of representings of it in a distinctive representational sense of correctness. Liability to attitudes that are assessments of correctness set by what thereby counts as represented is constitutive of having the normative status of a representing. So as I read him, Hegel endorses all three of the premises of Rorty's anti-authoritarian, global anti-representationalist argument for the conclusion that we should reject as fetishistic the idea of the ultimate authority of a represented, non-human, natural, objective reality over our cognitive practices, as, and for the same reasons, that we reject as fetishistic the idea of the ultimate authority of a non-human, supernatural being over our ethical practices. That's the story I told last time. That is, Hegel endorses all three of the crucial premises of this argument of Rorty. Both have ground-level commitments to social pragmatism about normativity, the idea that norms and normative significances are instituted by playing roles in our social practices and the constellations of practical attitudes that they make possible. Further, Hegel's particular model of the social institution of normative statuses by reciprocal recognitive attitudes builds in Rorty's insight that part of what the Enlightenment was rejecting about traditional understandings of normativity was the idea of authority not balanced by complementary responsibility. Genuine authority, Rorty thinks, must be rational authority in the sense that we're obliged to acknowledge the authority only if what we're in a position to hold responsible for providing reasons for its exercise of that authority. And finally, Rorty and Hegel agree with the Kantian analysis of representational relations as fundamentally involving a normative relation of authority and responsibility between representeds and representings. Rorty, in the argument I rehearsed last time, argues that if we think through the implications of the first two of those ideas, we'll see as confused and ultimately unintelligible the idea that the meaningfulness of our discourse is constituted by, or even essentially dependent on, normative representational relations between things that can give and ask for reasons, us, and things that cannot participate in those reasoning practices, cannot adopt those attitudes. We should not, Rorty thinks, acknowledge the authority of what we cannot interrogate and hold responsible for its reasons. In spite of their many fundamental agreements in this vicinity, though, Hegel does not follow Rorty in rejecting the idea of normatively inflected, specifically representational dimension of the contents of our discursive commitments. Nor does he reject the idea of an objective reality exercising normative authority over our cognitive commitments, which is what the representational dimension of conceptual contentfulness underwrites. So the question I want to address in the rest of my talk is, how can Hegel reconcile that with his embrace of the modern insight into the attitude dependence of normative statuses and his understanding of the institution of normative statuses by reciprocal recognitive attitudes? How does Hegel provide an answer to that argument of Rorty's? Hegel takes modernity's discovery of the attitude dependence of normative statuses, which I've been saying is social pragmatism about normativity, to be a decisive advance in our, and so in Geist's, self-consciousness. We've come to understand that our practical attitudes play an essential role in instituting the norms, governance by which makes us discursive sapient beings and not merely sentient natural ones. But he also thinks that this self-understanding is partial and incomplete, and that the evident substantial gain of the advance to modernity is mixed with a complementary loss. For Hegel, there's a worm in the apple of modernity. He calls it alienation and Fremdung. Alienation is a defect in the metaphysical structure of modern normativity, corresponding to fetishism, the defect in the traditional structure of normativity. In grossest terms, alienation is a loss of the binding force of the norms. Hegel calls what's lost Sittlichkeit, after Sitte, customs or mores, the traditional implicit form of governing norms. While Hegel wholeheartedly applauds the overcoming of the fetishism that takes norms to be objective features of the non-human world, something merely there, antecedently to and independently of our attitudes towards them, he thinks that coming to see them explicitly as the products of our practices, as something we're responsible for, threatens to undercut their practical authority over us. Traditional commitment to the status dependence of normative attitudes expressed a genuine insight, Hegel thinks, even though that insight took the deformed shape of the fetishistic reification of norms. Practical attitudes are intelligible, he thinks, as genuinely normative attitudes only if they're answerable to or responsible to, governed by the norms, the statuses that they're attitudes towards. The authority of norms over attitudes, the sense in which practical attitudes and conduct are bound or governed by norms, is twofold. It has deontic and alethic dimensions. First, the norms serve as standards for normative assessment of the correctness or propriety of attitudes. One should attribute to others, or acknowledge oneself, what the parties are actually committed to, the authority or responsibility that they actually have. That's something one can get wrong with one's attitudes. Second, the attitudes one adopts should be subjunctively sensitive to the contents of the statuses acknowledged or attributed, in the sense that if the norms or statuses were or had been different, the attitudes of acknowledging and attributing would be or would have been different. These are the two dimensions along which norms are practically efficacious as making a difference to the conduct of participants in the practice. Having that sort of significance is essential to its being normative statuses that are being acknowledged and attributed, toward which attitudes are being adopted. And Hegel thinks there's a substantial tension between norm governedness in this sense and the modern appreciation of the attitude dependence of norms. Seeing the norms as products of our attitudes can make it impossible to see those attitudes as genuinely governed by the resulting norms in this dual sense. As Wittgenstein, who had similar concerns, puts his version of this point, one would like to say, whatever is going to seem right to me is right, but that only means that here we can't talk about right. End of the quote. Alienation is losing our grip on the intelligibility of norms as genuinely binding on us as a result of understanding them as instituted by our own attitudes. The result is a picture that's attitudes all the way down, unanchored in any actual binding norms. Now, I think alienation in this sense is pretty much what Rorty's pragmatism both endorses in theory and adopts in practice. Rorty deliberately chooses the Romantic and Hegelian term, irony, for the sort of private detachment from the commitments that govern our public life that he recommends and esteems. Rorty's well aware that in his discussion of alienation in the Spirit chapter of the Phenomenology, Hegel identifies romantic irony as one of the most characteristic expressions of alienated modernity. Hegel would see Rorty's version of Deweyan pragmatism as a clear-eyed acknowledgement and deliberate embracing of our modern alienated predicament. As, according to Kant, I'm genuinely normatively bound only by norms whose bindingness I acknowledge, explicitly or implicitly, so for Rorty, we're bound only by those norms we can agree on. To have authority or to be responsible for Rorty just is to be practically taken or treated as authoritative or held responsible by the community. This is the serious thought behind such characteristic Rortyian throwaway lines as, "The truth is whatever your community will let you get away with." There is not and cannot intelligibly be anything else that's authoritative over our practices and practical attitudes. That's what Rorty means by anti-authoritarianism. And it's a consequence he draws fairly directly from his social pragmatism about norms. He agrees with Hegel in seeing the idea that our social practices institute the norms we're bound by as the principal lesson of the original Enlightenment. Authority is superiority and responsibility is subordination are not statuses ordained by God and revealed in Scripture, nor are they natural states to be discerned by careful empirical investigation. In calling for the completion of this movement in a second Enlightenment, Rorty appeals to the essentially normative character of representational relations to assimilate the idea of an objective represented reality cognitively authoritative over our representings of it, that is, our theoretical attitudes, to that of God, or an objective scala naturae, practically authoritative over the propriety of our conduct. For Rorty, both fall under the heading of non-human authority over human attitudes and are accordingly to be rejected as ultimately fetishistic and authoritarian. But Hegel disagrees. He thinks what's needed is a postmodern reconciliation of the modern insight into the attitude dependence of normative statuses with a suitably unalienated reappropriation of the traditional Sittlich insight into the status dependence of normative attitudes. The aim of such a synthetic reappropriation is to reestablish the intelligibility of the bindingness the rational bindingness, the genuine normative authority of norms that, though instituted by our practical attitudes, nonetheless transcend those attitudes sufficiently to normatively govern and constrain them. Among the various kinds of attitude transcendent norms he countenances, Hegel treats as central and essential those that articulate the representational dimension of conceptual content, the authority of represented states of affairs over representings of them in thought and talk. By contrast to Rorty, Hegel thinks that the relations between representeds and representings are intelligible as normative relations of authority and responsibility, even though we do not recognize, in Hegel's sense, what exercises representational authority as one of us givers of and askers for reasons. In particular, to be accorded normative authority by our practices and attitudes, what's represented need not itself, for Hegel, be either recognized by us as the subject of normative recognitive attitudes, nor itself adopt such attitudes towards us. Having our attitudes normatively governed, in the dual alethic and deontic sense, by something that does not itself have normative attitudes, and so cannot give and is not obliged to give reasons for such attitudes, is not, Hegel claims, incompatible with the modern insight that normative statuses are instituted by normative attitudes. What's required is only that the normative statuses of authority and responsibility, constitutive of the representational relation between representeds and representings, be itself instituted by our attitudes towards them, by the role they play in our practices. The challenge he faces in making out this claim in a way compatible with the insights and commitments he shares with Rorty is to say just how we need to act, what we need to do, so as to confer distinctively representational significance on what thereby acquire the practical normative significance of representeds and representings of them. The general form of Hegel's strategy for overcoming alienation and re-achieving unfetishistic Sittlichkeit by reconciling the modern insight into the attitude dependence of normative statuses with the traditional insight into the status dependence of normative attitudes is to appeal to the historical structure of the constellation of reciprocal authority and responsibility that relates attitudes and statuses. Hegel understands past attitudes as having instituted the norms that govern our current and future attitudes. The engine of his account is accordingly the idea of a new sort of rational activity, recollection, Erinnerung. Recollection is a retrospective, rational reconstruction that selects and assembles from a series of attitudes that have actually been adopted by practitioners an expressively progressive trajectory through them. To say that it is expressively progressive is to say that the reconstructed path has the shape of the gradual emergence into explicitness of a norm that can, with recollective hindsight, be seen to have implicitly governed the process all along. Recollection, Hegel says, turns a mere past into a history, the past comprehended as normatively significant. Recollection confers normative significance on the sequence of past attitudes, that is, past applications of concepts, by exhibiting it as having the distinctive norm-instituting recognitive structure of a tradition. That's a quite specific constellation of authority of the past over the present and the future, and the authority of the present and future over the past. It's a kind of active making, the institution of norms, that has the form of a finding of a norm as already implicitly governing the prior attitudes. The content of the norm is recollected as constant throughout, with each included episode of applying the norm by adopting an attitude, serving to reveal a bit more of that content, further expressing it by making explicit aspects that had hitherto remained explicit. And this recollective process has the structure of reciprocal recognition. A helpful model, I think, is provided by the evolution of legal concepts in Anglo-American common law. Here, there is no initial explicit governing statute. All there is to determine the content of legal concepts being applied is the history of their prior application by earlier judges. For this reason, it's sometimes described as judge-made law. The only authority a judge can claim for her decision to apply or withhold the application of a concept of common law, a concept such as negligence or strict liability, the only justification that a judge can give for applying such a concept to a new set of facts is the authority of earlier decisions. The rationale or justification for such a decision takes the form of a recollection of prior judicial attitudes as expressed by those decisions. From the welter of the actual record, some decisions are privileged as precedential. They're treated as having gradually but inexorably revealed important contours of the concept of the legal concept in question. A tradition is reconstructed consisting entirely of episodes treated as precedential and hence authoritative as to the content of the norm being discerned. In order properly to rationalize and justify the current decision, that tradition must be presented as the cumulative, progressive clarification of a norm or law, made visible as operative throughout the whole process. The reasons the judge gives justifying her current decision take the form of an explicit codification of the lessons learned along the way, as different aspects of the implicit norm or concept are shown as being brought into the explicit light of day by the prior precedential decisions. In common and case law, there is no content to the norm except what it's been imbued with by the authority of such jurisprudential decisions. The authority in each case essentially involves a correlative responsibility, though. That responsibility is administered by future judges, for they will recognize the precedential authority of the current decision only insofar as they take it to be licensed by, suitably responsible to, a suitable acknowledgement of the authority of the prior decisions privileged as precedential by those future judges in their recollective vindications of their own decisions. The authority of each decision depends on the reasons for it that can recollectively be extracted from the rationally reconstructed tradition it discerns. Recollection is accordingly a distinctive kind of rationalization. It's a process of rationalization that produces reasons, a process, as Hegel puts it, of giving contingency the normative form of necessity. Though historical recollective developmental processes are essentially asymmetrical because diachronic, they also exhibit the symmetrical structure of authority and responsibility characteristic of reciprocal recognition. Each judge is both a recognizer and a petitioner for recognition. Recognition that, if successful, results in the judge being recognized in turn. The judge only has the normative status she claims, the authority of a correct precedential decision, if she's in fact recognized as having it by future judges who adopt attitudes of attributing that authority. The ones she recognizes, the prior judges to whom she attributes precedential authority, to whom she accordingly acknowledges responsibility, are not the same individuals on whose recognition she depends for the actualization of her attitudes, for the transformation of her claim to authority into the actual status of authority. Those are the future judges who assess the fidelity of her recollection to the authority of the precedents to which they themselves acknowledge responsibility. Yet the present judge, like all of the judges in the tradition, has authority only insofar as she succeeds in making herself responsible to the attitudes of others in the diachronic recognitive community, that is, the tradition, constituted by their recollections. She makes herself recognitively responsible both to past and future judges in these different but symmetrical ways by adopting the attitude of claiming authority that's implicit in making a decision at all. It's of the essence of recollection that the concepts, norms, or laws that emerge from this process, that jurisprudential recollection reveals and makes more explicit, can both be judge-made and provide genuine reasons for deciding cases one way rather than another. The deciding judge recollectively claims the authority of what she takes or treats as precedent in providing the reasons justifying her own decision. And those reasons are genuine. They actually have the authority claimed for them, just insofar as they're recognized in turn as reasons by later judges, who have the authority to treat the present decision itself as precedential and authoritative, insofar as they take it suitably to have fulfilled its responsibility to the reasons provided by the tradition it both inherits and retrospectively constitutes. Hegel thinks that the recollective recognitive process that I've described as determining the content of legal concepts in common law jurisprudence also determines the contents of our ordinary empirical descriptive concepts and that of their sophisticated scientific relatives. In the case of applying empirical concepts as opposed to legal ones, he understands each phase of the process of experience to include three stages. It begins with the registration of an anomaly, the acknowledgement that one finds oneself with commitments that are incompatible by one's own lights, according to one's own understanding of the contents to which one is committed. They're incompatible in the sense that one cannot become entitled to them both. Because the motor of experience is always the acknowledgement of the conflict of one's commitments with each other, for Hegel, experience is always the experience of error. Practically acknowledging that incompatibility is taking oneself to be obliged to do something, to change something. This is the obligation to engage in a process of repair of the anomaly, to replace rational discord with rational harmony by altering or giving up some of the offending commitments. That's the second stage in each episode of experience. And this much is already in Kant, as Hegel reads him. What one's doing in making a judgment is undertaking a specific task responsibility, the responsibility to do something. What one is undertaking the responsibility to do is to rationally integrate that commitment with one's prior commitments by finding reasons justifying it, acknowledging the consequences that follow from it, and, in the case that matters most for Hegel, resolving any incompatibilities that result from taking the new claim on board. Doing this is what Kant calls synthesizing a constellation of commitments that exhibits the sort of systematic rational unity distinctive of sapient awareness, what he calls the synthetic unity of apperception. At this point, though, Hegel moves decisively beyond the Kantian paradigm by adding a crucial constraint on what counts as successful repairs of commitments acknowledged as discordant. So he sees the first two phases of experience as acknowledged already in Kant. The third one, that's Hegel's new idea. When anomalies occur, perhaps prompted by perceptual judgments non-inferentially wrenched from the subject as the immediate deliverances of sense, the passive exercise of conceptual abilities, not just any rejiggering that removes the incompatibilities suffices in Hegel's view. Successful repairs must explain and justify the changes made in a special way by taking a distinctive form. Vindication of a proposed reparative strategy in response to acknowledgement of incompatible commitments must take the form of a special kind of historical narrative, a recollection. One must tell a retrospective story that rationally reconstructs an idealized, expressively progressive trajectory through previous changes of view that culminates in the view being endorsed after the repair of the most recently discovered anomaly. In the first stage of the experience of error, the previous conception of how things are, what played the role to consciousness of what things are in themselves, has been unmasked as appearance and has accordingly shifted status. It now plays the role to consciousness of being only what things were for consciousness, an erroneous view of how things really are, an appearance of it. The idea is that to justify endorsing a new view as veridically representing how things really are in themselves, one must show how, assuming that things are that way, one did or could have come to know that things are that way. Doxastically endorsing a conceptual content is taking it to be fact-stating, to present how things are in themselves. That what one takes to be facts, which contents exactly one endorses, changes over the course of experience, is just a change in the status of the contents involved during the registration and repair stages of the experience of error. The old content changes status from being endorsed to not being endorsed, and its replacement changes status from not being endorsed to being endorsed. What was to consciousness noumenal reality is unmasked as phenomenal appearance and replaced by a different content, newly endorsed as objectively factual. The third recollective stage of an experience of error justifies this change of status by forging a distinctive kind of link between the content newly endorsed as noumenal and all the previously endorsed contents that now are taken to be phenomena. It's a representational link, in virtue of which they show up to the conscious subject as phenomenal appearances of that noumenal reality as one has found it out to be. The link is forged by offering a retrospective, recollective, rational reconstruction of a sequence of phenomena, culminating in the facts as one currently takes them to be. That rational reconstruction exhibits them as all along implicitly normatively governed by their link to that noumenal reality, in the sense that it serves as the normative standard by which their adequacy as phenomenal appearances of how things actually are is to be assessed. Doxastic commitments are not just fact expressing. For Hegel, they are further always implicitly knowledge claims. And the demand for recollective vindication of one's commitments codifies Hegel's version of the justification dimension of claims to knowledge. This distinctive kind of justification requires showing how the previous views one held in the process leading up to the current candidate can properly be understood as views, appearances, or representings of what one now endorses to be the reality one claims was all along being viewed, appearing, or being represented. To be entitled to claim that things are as one now takes them to be, one must show how one found out that they are so. And doing that involves explaining what one's earlier views got right, what they got wrong, and why. It involves rationally reconstructing the sequence of one's previous views of what one now takes to be the same topic, so as to exhibit it as a process of learning, of gradual discovery of how things actually are. That's the progressive emergence into explicitness, the ever more adequate expression of what's retrospectively discerned as having been all along implicit in the norm governing and guiding the process by which its appearances arise and pass away. Offering such a retrospective, recollective, historical, rational reconstruction of the process leading up to the constellation of commitments whose endorsement is being vindicated as the lesson properly to be learned from the earlier registering and reparative phases is the final recollective phase of a tripartite episode in the experience of error. Recollection transforms a mere description of past commitments into a progressive narrative of a sequence of lessons, whereby how things really are in themselves, according to one's current commitments, gradually came to be revealed through that progressive sequence of ever more adequate appearances, culminating in one's current happy state of, as one takes it to be, knowledge of how things really are. A recollecting narrative is a narrative of expressive progress. It's a story about how what is now revealed to have been all along implicit in prior commitments as the reality they were appearances of, the noumena behind the phenomena, gradually emerged to become fully explicit, showing up as what it really is in the view currently endorsed in which that process culminated. It's a story of how what things are in themselves, an sich, becomes what they are for consciousness. Hegel says, quote, "Already something thought, the content is the property of substance. Existence has no more to be changed into the form of what is in itself and implicit, but only the implicit, no longer merely something primitive or lying hidden within existence, but already present as a recollection, into the form of what is explicit, of what is objective to self. End of the quote. A recollection accordingly exhibits past commitments that have been discarded because of their incompatibility with others as genuine, if only partially correct, appearances of reality, representations of it as it is now known to be, and in that sense, not merely illusory. This recollective story about the representational dimension of conceptual content offers an expressive account of it. It explains how what was, according to each recollection, always implicit, an sich, what things are in themselves, becomes ever more explicit for consciousness. The recollective story is an expressively progressive one. The representational relation between senses and reference is explained by displaying a sequence of appearances that are ever more adequate expressions of an underlying reality. In general, Hegel thinks we can understand what's implicit only in terms of the expressive process by which it's made explicit. And that's always a recollective process. The underlying reality is construed as implicit in the sense of being a norm that all along governed the process of its gradual emergence into explicitness. Without at any earlier point being fully explicit to the consciousness undergoing the experience, according to the recollection that unveils it as what the appearances were appearances of, it nonetheless practically, hence implicitly, governed the process. According to the retrospective rational reconstruction that is the recollection, it served as a normative standard for better or worse appearances, accordingly as they revealed, expressed, that reality more adequately. And according to the recollection, those assessments were efficacious. The meta-norm that governs recollection, determining better and worse recollections, demands expressive progress, progress in making explicit what shows up as having been all along already implicit. This recollective notion of expression is more fundamental for Hegel than the notion of representation that it's called on to explain. Telling that sort of recollective reconstructive story is offering what he calls a phenomenology of a view, a set of commitments. A phenomenology vindicates that view by showing how it gradually emerged into the explicit light of day from the partial, variously erroneous appearances of it. That's what Hegel does at the meta level for various shapes, he calls them, of self-consciousness and ultimately of the whole of Geist in his book called The Phenomenology. The final adequate form of self-consciousness, what he alarmingly calls absolute knowing, knows itself as engaging in a process of this historical recollective kind in its dynamic experience of ground level empirical and practical commitments and the determinate concepts that articulate them. Such a phenomenology vindicates the endorsement of some conceptual contents as noumenal reality, as objectively factual, by showing how they explain the sequential variety of phenomenal appearances by which a subject comes to know them as noumenal reality, and they thereby explain the advent of that knowledge. So, as I've told the story, Hegel understands the social fine structure of normativity as communities synthesized by reciprocal recognition. And he understands the historical fine structure of normativity as traditions retrospectively synthesized by recollection. Along both dimensions, the social and the historical, norms precipitate out of, are instituted by, attitudes. That's the attitude dependence of normative statuses that is the principal discovery of modernity. But the picture is not attitudes all the way down. Recognitive attitudes, according to Hegel, do institute genuine normative statuses, and those norms are made visible as genuinely governing the attitudes in turn. Practical attitudes or performances are genuinely governed by norms or statuses in the sense I've been discussing, only if they're responsible to those norms along two dimensions, deontic and alethic. It's a criterion of adequacy by which recollections are assessed by future recollectors, that the norms they discern are authoritative for all the attitudes in the retrospectively constituted tradition. They provide standards for assessment of the correctness of those attitudes, which are in that sense genuinely responsible to them for their correctness. And all the prior attitudes, applications of concepts, that are certified by a recollective rational reconstruction as expressively progressive, as precedential or correct, are exhibited as having been subjunctively sensitive to, and in that sense not only responsible, but responsive to the implicit norm they explicate. Normative governance of attitudes in this dual sense of their deontic responsibility and alethic subjunctive sensitivity to norms is the status dependence of normative attitudes. The result of the rational reconstruction of an expressively progressive tradition by recollection is the revelation of a governing norm to which the attitudes that make up that tradition are both responsible and genuinely responsive. So Hegel offers an account both of how normative statuses are instituted by reciprocal recognition and how they become recollectively visible as having genuinely binding force over attitudes. In this way, he reconciles the modern appreciation of the attitude dependence of normative statuses with a reconceived version of the traditional commitment to the status dependence of normative attitudes that shows us that alienation from our norms is not an inevitable consequence of the modern insight. That central implicit insight of modernity, we've seen, just is social pragmatism about normativity. Hegel shows how pragmatists need not be normative nihilists or merely ironists. Because of the sort of conceptual norms recollection determines provide reasons for judgments and action, not only in courts of law, it also shows that pragmatists need not be irrationalists. Both of these are conclusions Rorty argued for and sought to defend, though not by wheeling in the heavy metaconceptual machinery of recognition and recollection that Hegel deploys. I suggested earlier that endorsing social pragmatism about normativity, acknowledging that norms are instituted by social practices, need not rule out a community's investing normative significance in something other than each other. A community can grant authority to the flights of birds or the patterns of fire-induced cracks on a tortoise shell by taking or treating those natural occurrences as normatively significant. That's one form that practical attitudes instituting normative statuses can take. Anthropology provides many examples of just such conferral of normative significance on merely natural occurrences. I also considered last time Rorty's rejoinder to the pointing out of this possibility. Pragmatists about semantics understand the contents of our utterances and thoughts in terms of the functional role they play in norm-governed discursive social practices. And specifically, discursive authority and responsibility is essentially, and not just accidentally, rational authority and responsibility. It's inseparable from the liability speakers and thinkers have to demands for reasons for the commitments they avow and acknowledge. The authority of their claims is conditional on their fulfilling their responsibility to provide suitable reasons for them when appropriately challenged to do so. Kant was right to see the task responsibility that gives practical weight to cognitive claims, what one must do in order to be entitled to the authority one claims, to be the responsibility to offer reasons justifying those commitments and to acknowledge the further commitments for which they provide reasons in turn. This kind of authority, discursive authority, the sort of authority that provides reasons for us to believe what's claimed, can in principle only be possessed or exercised by those who participate with us in our practices of giving and asking for reasons, persons, not things. It's this thought that grounds the deep connection Rorty, following Dewey, sees between a proper semantics and a liberal democratic politics, between reason and freedom. Hegel, as I've been reading him, agrees both with the observation that social pragmatism is compatible with the communities conferring normative statuses on things that cannot themselves adopt normative attitudes, and with the basis of the rejoinder. Rational authority is inseparable from a correlative responsibility to provide reasons. Social practices of giving and asking for reasons are necessarily the basis of discursive practice, and the norms such practices institute and apply. But on that basis, Hegel then builds a further kind of rationality, historical, recollective rationality. This telling of Hegel's story revolves around two master ideas. First, on the pragmatic side, is his social understanding of normativity in terms of mutual recognition. Second, articulating his pragmatism, is the conception of a new kind of rationality. It consists in a historical understanding of the relations between conceptual content and implicitly normative discursive practices in terms of an expressive process of recollection. Each of these ideas comprises a number of subsidiary ones and is articulated by an intricate fine structure relating them. The model of expression is recollection, the story about what one must do to count as thereby making explicit something that was implicit, is in many ways the keystone of Hegel's conceptual edifice. It explains the representational, semantic, and cognitive relation between how things appear for consciousness, as he says, on the subjective side of thought, and how things really are in themselves on the objective side of being. It explains the constitutive reciprocal relations between normative attitudes and normative statuses, how attitudes both institute norms and answer to them. And it explains the relations between those two stories, how normative practices bring about semantic relations. In Hegel's terms, explaining how cognition presupposes recognition is explaining how consciousness presupposes self-consciousness. Hegel extends Rortian and Deweyan pragmatism by explaining how what one is practically doing in recollecting, the process of producing a retrospective, recollective, rational reconstruction of a course of experience as expressively progressive. He explains how what one's practically doing in recollecting provides the basis for an expressive semantic account of normative representational relations between the human and the non-human. Hegel understands what things are in themselves, objective reality, in terms of the functional role those things play in our discursive practices as normatively governing our claims about them, in the dual deontic and alethic sense of normative governance. He appeals to the notion of recollection to specify the fine structure of the attitudes that acknowledge something as playing that role. How things are in themselves is seen to emerge recollectively from a sequence of how things show up for consciousness, the reality behind what are now visible as appearances of it. Both Rorty and Dewey avowedly and evidently learned important lessons from Hegel's historicism. Both distinguished themselves from their fellow philosophers by the extent to which they in fact practiced exactly the recollective rationality that Hegel preached. Their different but largely consonant diagnoses of the ills of their respective philosophical milieus took the form of sweeping metaconceptual narratives of the intellectual heritage and traditions that shaped them. Yet from my point of view, Rorty and Dewey both in the end failed to appreciate the overarching significance of Hegel's historicism, for they didn't pay sufficient attention to its fine structure, Hegel's invention of the meta-concept of recollective rationality as the structure of what he called Vernunft, and the philosophical work he called on it to do in understanding both the transitions to and beyond modernity, and so in reconciling social pragmatism with what was right about representationalism. I've argued that Hegel presents a detailed, constructive, anti-authoritarian, non-fetishistic, unalienated, social pragmatist account of the representational dimension of conceptual content. He thereby offers a concrete pragmatist alternative to global semantic and epistemological anti-representationalism. He anticipates the challenge to the very idea of objective reality as providing norms for thought that Rorty sees fundamental Enlightenment insights as mounting. This was the lesson Rorty thought required for us a second Enlightenment to appreciate. But Hegel sees Rortyan irony no less than the romantic irony from which it develops, as theoretical and practical alienation from the tradition constituting and tradition articulating norms, as ultimately a confession of failure to reconcile their acculturating role in making us what we are with our role in instituting those very norms. This is the failure to bring together in one vision the two senses in which the norms are ours, the sense in which we make them and the sense in which they make us by acculturating us. Already in 1806, I'm claiming, Hegel anticipated Rorty's argument and the alienating, ironic, pragmatist challenge to the very intelligibility of the representational paradigm, which Rorty offers on behalf of our responsibility to reasons, and so to each other as reason givers. Hegel's pragmatist account of the fine structure of normativity, in terms of the way reason in its recollective function administers the interplay of attitude governing normative statuses and norm instituting attitudes, shows how the emancipation from alien authority the Enlightenment promised can be achieved without the alienation that its insights seem to entail. I want to close quickly then by reverting to the Kant-Hegel question with which I began my first lecture. From the point of view of the Hegelian response I've rehearsed to the anti-authoritarian global anti-representationalist argument that Rorty announced in Girona, Rorty appears himself to remain mired in alienated Kantian analytic Verstand, unable to make the momentous step to Hegelian recollective Vernunft. To this extent, and in this respect, Rorty shows up as unable fully to disentangle himself from the coils of Kantian thought he had been struggling to wrestle free of since Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature, as he rigorously followed out what he saw as the unavoidable consequences of the social pragmatism about normativity that he extracts from what Dewey made of Hegel. As I see it, this leaves the discussion with a new, heightened, transformed, specifically pragmatist version of the Kant-Hegel question. Should pragmatists embrace the concept of representation and its associated understanding of the reality we represent, reconstrued along Hegelian lines of recollective rationality? Should the concept of experience be rehabilitated as Hegelian Erfahrung, the three-stage process I described? To do so would be to complete the circle Rorty began when he rejected what he properly understood as ultimately Kantian conceptions of representation and experience in Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. The question for us then becomes whether pragmatism's advance from Kant should be understood and developed in Rorty's way or in Hegel's. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk, Professor Brandom. And we have a quarter of an hour left for questions and answers. And my colleague, Christian Skirke, is going to chair this discussion.
Thank you, and we'll go straight into it. I've got a question by Kevin Peters to start with, and I'll just read these questions more or less as they come in. Here we go. It's about Hegel's reciprocal recognition model and the chess grandmaster example. So the chess player example works on the assumption that it's possible to be recognized as a grandmaster. In other words, if you have the skills and one might add the aspirations, you will come to be recognized in terms of being a grandmaster. However, is a social reality where some people are not recognized on different grounds, although they have the skills to be recognized on these terms, a situation that Hegel can include? That's the question.
Yes, I mean, indeed, Hegel puts concern with that question at the center of his discussion of the master and slave, which is allegorical for what's metaphysically defective about the traditional conception of normativity in terms of subordination and obedience, which is authority that's unbalanced by reciprocal responsibility, where the authority of some to recognize people as ones of us, as grandmasters, as academic philosophers, as writers, is unbalanced by responsibility on the part of those we recognize, swings free, as the master understands it, of responsibility to those who are recognized as having the authority over us, whose recognition it is that makes us authoritative. And Hegel argues that, though of course, as a matter of fact, communities where recognition is not reciprocal are possible and actual, that's the communities we find all around us. He thinks that there's a kind of practical defect in such communities because the superiors, the ones with authority unbalanced by responsibility, are the superiors. The masters are the masters only in virtue of being recognized as such by the slaves, by the subordinates. Their authority is in fact responsible to a reflection of the authority of those who accord it to them. And yet it's of the essence of mastery to deny that the slave, that the subordinate has any authority, to deny that the recognitions of the subordinate can institute any genuine status at all. And this is a metaphysical defect that he argues will revenge itself on any such communities.
Thank you. Now here's a question by Frank Weins, whoever is behind that name. Does Rorty believe, or Hegel for that matter, that those who go to the trouble of acquiring a better developed ability for reason giving, and then also the rather rare courage to be held accountable for those reasons, well, is the belief that the normative status of these people is, let's say, higher or superior to the ordinary citizen, bouncing off what you just said about the superiority of normative statuses?
Yeah, I mean, not surprisingly, Hegel is more sanguine about this than Rorty is. Rorty will say, well, it depends on your community, because their right to have their utterances given more weight, accorded more authority, in virtue of their capacity to acknowledge their responsibility by giving better reasons for it, is efficacious just insofar as it's actually recognized by the community. And as we know, though there is a dimension of authority, indeed of political authority, when we're deliberating about what we should do and so who we should be, there is a dimension along which we acknowledge this peculiar force of the better reason that so puzzled and fascinated the ancient Greeks, but it is by no means dominant or necessary. It's fragile and always at risk. Hegel thinks that implicit in our being committed to things being a certain way, to making claims, to endorsing intentions, that if we just see what we're implicitly committing ourselves by doing that, we'll see that we're implicitly committing ourselves to acknowledge the authority of the better reason. That's why he thinks, that's what he thinks achieving ultimate self-consciousness, absolute knowing, consists in, is making explicit that implicit commitment to acknowledging the force of the better reason as part of what we're implicitly committed to in talking and acting intentionally at all. That's why he thinks the phenomenology can be a semantics with edifying intent, a semantics such that if we understand meaning in his way, it will make us better people, because we will see what we're implicitly committed to by being discursive beings at all.
Thank you. I've got a general question about your Hegel, very short one by Roman Pankow. Now, if Hegel can be interpreted indeed as a pragmatist, then how do you negotiate the fact that for Hegel, the inherent development of Geist is something necessary and not something that is historical in a more contingent sense, something that is historically and socially contingent?
Well, good. I mean, recollective rationality is the process of giving what is historically contingent the form of necessity. Necessity for Hegel is always retrospective. It's not that having reached a certain stage, prospectively one can say, oh, the only way this could develop is in this following direction. The owl of Minerva flies only at dusk. It's only looking backward that necessity arises. And the necessity is retrospective in the sense that the only way you could get to here, to where we are, is by going through these particular stages. But in a prospective sense, there's no necessity that we get to where we are here. Now, I should say, I think it's absolutely critical in reading Hegel to distinguish his story about determinate conceptual contents, which he thinks the process of experience just rolls on into the indefinite future for those, as opposed to speculative philosophical concepts, the ones that articulate our self-consciousness, which he thinks can achieve full adequacy, has become a meta language in terms of which we can make explicit what we're doing in that messy ground level course of experience. And so he does think that achieving absolute knowing of self-consciousness is, well, the only adequate understanding of self-consciousness. It's not that nothing else could have happened in history, but no historical process that ended up anywhere else would have counted as progressive in that case. There's no analog of that for ordinary empirical concepts.
Thank you. Now I've got a question by Sudeep Dasgupta. He asks whether a pragmatist reading of Hegel can deal with what in Hegel is called the labor of the negative as a force which does not just lead to, let's say, what we find in the world, but indeed to interrogate the kind of things that Kant would call noumenal, so deep metaphysical things, i.e., is all error that we undergo something temporary and something that we can synthesize away, or does the adherence to the truth mean that we can also end up, as it were, in a sort of negative dialectic where we unveil alienation as our constant condition, that there's no further Aufhebung that gets us out of the alienated state?
Okay, well, I want to say there's a couple of different questions there. One about self-consciousness and alienation, and there I think, Hegel thinks we can get beyond alienation to an unalienated postmodern state of adequate self-consciousness. But as far as ground level experience is concerned, I was emphasizing the retrospective progressive aspect that you see looking back recollectively from every standpoint. Hegel also thinks that every set of determinate commitments is doomed, if we just correctly apply the norms, is doomed to lead us to commitments that are incompatible by our own lights. Where Hegel saw the conceptual inexhaustibility of sensuous immediacy, of the stubborn recalcitrance of reality, in terms of its being an infinite task to put what you see when you look at the back of your hand, say, into the form of judgments, that there could always be more judgments that you had yet to make. Hegel radically sees that transcendence of the conceptual by sensuous immediacy as manifesting itself in the instability of our concepts, that any set of conceptual commitments achieved by a successful recollection will, if we correctly apply those norms by our own lights, end up with us having commitments that are incompatible by our own lights, telling us that the concepts we've got and the beliefs we have are not quite right. So he sees the course of experience as the continual achievement and re-achievement of truth viewed retrospectively and prospectively as a path of despair, where every constellation of commitments we have, theoretical and practical, is destined to be found wanting in its own terms. And part of absolute knowing is realizing that too, that there is no resting place for a practical and empirical activity. That's the power of the negative.
Thank you. There's a question by Michael Vaines. In Hegel or Rorty's account, he says, there's nothing that can be authoritative to us over and above what is instituted by our normative attitudes. As it stands, this account seems to lack any reference, according to which any given community should attempt to organize itself such that expectations we have of others and of ourselves do not devolve to the lowest denominator. My question is then, how, according to such a paradigm, a community is able to assess its quality over and above what it has merely received and therefore implicitly recognizes as part of the unreflective, maybe baseless assumptions of its own tradition.
Okay, here I think there's a fork in the road, and Rorty and Hegel go in completely different directions. Hegel's view is that we can look at the self-understanding of a community as better or worse insofar as it has succeeded in making explicit to itself what is implicit in its undertaking commitments as to how things are in judgment and as to how things shall be in intention at all. And this is an objective standard of self-consciousness. Have you developed the tools, and are you applying the tools? Do you understand what it is we're doing in the course of experience? And that insofar as one has not, that one's self-consciousness will display its inadequacy by contradicting itself and making available to be made explicit more aspects of this recollective process that we're engaging in, which is more appreciation of the extent to which it's the practices of giving and asking for reasons that bind us, that make us what we are. So Hegel has a sunny view about this, not that it's inevitable that it actually happens, but that there is this intrinsic force in self-consciousness to greater self-consciousness, and that is a force towards greater rationality. Rorty's view is that we're stuck in our communities. One of his more frightening slogans is that politically we should be governed by fear, not by hope. By that he means not by utopian projections of how things are, but by a retrospective sense of what mistakes we've made in, for instance, unduly restricting the voting franchise, arbitrarily restricting it, and trying not to remake versions of that same mistake. Why can't 16-year-olds vote? Why can't 12-year-olds vote? And so on. And when he's asked, well, where do we stand when we look at some community and say, look, their norms are bad. They went in a bad political direction, or are still pre-modern, fetishistic, and so on. And at that point, Rorty becomes abashedly ethnocentric. He says, look, you can only assess these things on the basis of what seem to you better and worse reasons, and we're just condemned to use that set of standards when we assess other communities. That doesn't mean that their assessments of us are equally good. We have good reasons to think that we're doing this better than they are, but that ethnocentrism, indeed, as far as the superiority of democratic making of collective decisions by giving and asking for reasons. That, he says, ultimately, the credentials of that are going to be ethnocentric. And we need to embrace that contingency and acknowledge it. And he's concerned that we not be alienated by it and think, oh, well, if our capacity to acknowledge those reasons is contingent in this way, then they can't be really real reasons. That, too, he wants to get past.
Thank you very much indeed for not only a wonderful and very stimulating and interesting talk, but also for your answers to all these different questions. Thank you very much for being the Spinoza chair this year. And some of us are privileged and we'll see you back in the staff colloquium. And I'm afraid the others have to do with the film, which will be on the website, I suppose, next week. Thank you so much. And it's a tradition to announce the Spinoza chair of next year's at the end of the second lecture. And that will be Professor Charles Mills. He's professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University in New York. And he was supposed to come already last year, which wasn't possible. And we weren't really Zooming in this way a year ago. So yeah, he'll be here next year. Thank you so much again, Professor Brandom, and have a good day.